Welcome to NTD Evening News. Our top story tonight, Hurricane Helene slammed into Florida's Gulf Coast Thursday as a powerful Category 4 storm. Storm surges remain a threat. Mandatory evacuations were ordered for several counties, and millions across the southeast are facing power outages. New York City Mayor Eric Adams appears in court today. He pleads not guilty to taking bribes and illegal campaign contributions. Kamala Harris is making her first trip to the U.S.-Mexico border as the Democratic presidential nominee, a preview of what she's expected to say. After meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy this morning, former President Trump is in Michigan, holding a town hall event in Warren. Israel's prime minister addresses the United Nations in New York while his military attacks Hezbollah's headquarters in Lebanon. Arian Pasdar tells us what the U.S. is saying about the attack. And top American and Chinese diplomats met today in New York City. China's support for Russia is a point of contention for the two countries.
This is NTD Evening News, live from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Helene made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region last night, leaving millions without power and claiming more than 40 lives across 4 states. The storm toppled trees, ripped homes apart, and forced rescue teams into urgent efforts to save residents from the floodwaters. NTD's Christina Corona tells us the latest.
Helene has weakened to a tropical depression. As of 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Helene was located 50 miles southeast of Louisville, Kentucky, with sustained winds of 35 miles per hour. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear expressed that most of the expected rainfall today, around 70%, is based on current models, though the full impact remains uncertain.
Well, as it's coming up, really what we are looking at in this event is widespread rain and gusty winds. The widespread rain is 3 to 5 inches possible all the way through Sunday night. I believe the vast majority of the rain we're going to see today, maybe 70%. But as you're looking at the various models and what it could mean, this end of this system could stop pretty much right above central Kentucky and dump rain on us all the way through the end of Sunday.
It made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region as a Category 4 storm late last night. Emergency services are now trying to rescue anyone trapped by rapidly rising waters. Governor Ron DeSantis and officials gave an update on the storm.
We've had thousands of missions successfully completed in the overnight hours throughout the state, and all the calls that any state officials responded to last night, we were able to find the person or people and pets and bring them to safety.
At dawn, the storm-weary region revealed overturned boats, flattened homes, and a landscape submerged in several feet of floodwater. A storm surge warning remains in effect along Florida's west coast from Indian Pass to Tampa Bay. Surges are expected to reach up to 10 feet. The Washington Post reported that Helene, measuring approximately 420 miles in width, is one of the largest storms on record to hit the Gulf Coast. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper also provided an update on Tropical Storm Helene.
Priority now is saving lives. Helene is causing life-threatening flash flooding, numerous landslides, and downed trees causing power outages. Flooding will continue through the weekend in some areas and may even occur in areas that don't typically flood.
The Category 4 hurricane caused power outages at several hospitals in southern Georgia, prompting Governor Brian Kemp to report that authorities had to use chainsaws to clear debris and reopen roads. The storm has reportedly caused at least 42 deaths across the southeast.
We know that one of those was a first responder. When we ask people to stay off the roads and be patient, it's because we are trying to get to people. It is a very dangerous environment, and one of our finest has lost his life trying to save others.
Approximately 4 million people in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia are currently without power. There are concerns the outages could persist for weeks. Forecasters predict that Helene will shift northwest and slow down over the Tennessee Valley later today and into Saturday. Christina Corona, NTD News.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams is facing serious federal charges related to bribery and campaign finance violations. NTD's Jason Perry has the latest details.
I'm here right outside of the federal courthouse in Manhattan, where New York City Mayor Eric Adams has pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against him. He's currently being charged with bribery, fraud, and illegally soliciting campaign contributions from a foreign national. Federal prosecutors have accused him of funneling money from Turkish sources in his 2021 mayoral campaign and for pressuring city officials to allow Turkey's new consulate to open, even though it would have failed a fire inspection. The charges date back to 2014 when Adams was Brooklyn Borough president. Adams' lawyer, Alex Spiro, said this after leaving the courthouse.
This case isn't even a real case. This is the airline upgrade corruption case. The third thing we said is that we demand that they bring exculpatory information and the discovery to court on Wednesday. As you know from looking at the indictment and from what happened in court, there are no emails, text messages, or any corroboration whatsoever that the mayor knew about anything having to do with these campaign donations. The entire body of evidence is one staffer that says there was a conversation. What you have not learned is that that staffer has lied, and the government is in possession of that lie.
Adams is the first of 110 New York City mayors to face criminal charges while in office. And Adams said he plans to continue his duties as mayor of New York City. However, if he's found guilty, he could face decades in prison. New York Governor Kathy Hochul said she's reviewing her options and obligations, but she stopped short of calling for Adams to resign. Adams' lawyer said he plans to file a motion to dismiss the charges next week.
Vice President Kamala Harris will be making her first trip to the U.S.-Mexico border since becoming the Democratic nominee. She'll be making her case on an issue that polls indicate is her most challenging. NTD's Jason Blair reports.
Vice President Kamala Harris will be speaking in the border town of Douglas, Arizona. According to a Harris-Walz campaign aide, Harris will talk about her plan to address the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border, including calling for more resources for Border Patrol agents and proposing new machines that can detect fentanyl. With illegal U.S.-Mexico border crossings reaching record levels the past few years, Harris's Republican opponent had some things to say ahead of her trip to Arizona.
Our country's never been under siege like this. She keeps talking about how she supposedly wants to fix the border. We would merely ask, why didn't she do it 4 years ago?
In March of 2021, President Biden tasked Harris with leading the response to border challenges, specifically immigration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which have been significant contributors to illegal border crossings. Harris will also likely highlight how she pushed for a federal immigration bill that failed in Congress after Trump openly opposed it, as well as talk about her past work as California Attorney General.
I went after the transnational gangs, the drug cartels, and human traffickers. I prosecuted them in case after case.
Harris is scheduled to speak at around 7:45 p.m. Eastern. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
As Vice President Harris is traveling to the border, former President Trump is campaigning today across the battleground state of Michigan. Iris Tao has more from the city of Warren.
Campaigning across the important battleground state of Michigan, former President Trump today took aim at Vice President Kamala Harris's latest trip to the border by highlighting numbers by the eyes and saying that over 13,000 illegal immigrants currently living in the U.S. were convicted of homicide. Here's a clip of Trump's remarks in Walker, Michigan. Watch.
According to this brand new data, never seen before, over 13,099 convicted murderers have crossed the border.
Vice President Harris, meanwhile, has been criticizing Trump and blaming him for causing a bipartisan Senate border deal to fall apart, which Trump denied on Friday. Meanwhile, as the two are campaigning in important battleground states here in Warren, Michigan, Trump's participating in a town hall tonight to be moderated by Senator Marsha Blackburn. We know that the two have been very outspoken about unfair trade practices by China, and tonight the focus will be the auto industry, as Trump has been recently vowing to ramp up tariffs on China to protect American workers and industries. But Vice President Harris, meanwhile's campaign released a new ad right before Trump's trip here today, accusing Trump of making empty promises to American workers. Watch.
If I'm elected, you won't lose one plant. You'll have plants coming into this country. You're going to have jobs again.
The news today couldn't have come at a worse time. Just weeks now until Christmas, and General Motors has now revealed it will lay off workers in Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland. Thousands of jobs.
And both candidates are vowing to bring back auto jobs to the U.S. And earlier today, Trump met with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy at Trump Tower in New York, which is just one day after Zelenskyy met with both President Biden and Vice President Harris at the White House. And Trump said at the meeting that he hoped that the war will come to an end under his administration, which will be very soon, he says, and that he would give a deal to both sides that is fair, while Zelenskyy saying that Ukraine is counting on the U.S. no matter who wins in the November elections.
If we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it.
After November, we have to decide, and we hope that the strength of the United States will be very strong, and we count on it. That's why I decided to meet with both candidates with all honor.
And while it's Friday, Trump is not taking any break from the campaign trail, as we're just 38 days before the election now. Trump is heading to Wisconsin tomorrow for a rally, and then to Pennsylvania on Sunday. And on Monday, his campaign told me that he's heading to Milwaukee before the VP debate on Tuesday. Reporting from Warren, Michigan, Iris Howe, NTD News.
In less than a week, vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance will debate right here in New York City. NTD will have on-the-ground coverage, in-depth analysis, and a lot more prepared for you during our pre- and post-debate show on The Nation Decides 2024, presented by Steve Lance and myself. Watch it next Tuesday, October 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu giving a long-anticipated speech before the United Nations today. That's as Israel struck Hezbollah's headquarters in the capital city of Lebanon. NTD's international correspondent Ariane Pastar has the Israel update.
Loud rounds of applause from some delegates, but also groups of delegates leaving in protest as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived at the United Nations on Friday. Netanyahu says he decided to speak at the gathering when he saw that leaders from other nations allegedly spread lies about Israel at the UN meeting.
And here's the truth. Israel seeks peace. Israel yearns for peace. Israel has made peace and will make peace again.
To illustrate his point, Netanyahu held up two maps of the Middle East. The first one was titled The Blessing, showing Israel and its allies connecting Europe to Asia.
Across this bridge, we will lay rail lines, energy pipelines, fiber optic cables, and this will serve the betterment of 2 billion people. Look at the second map. It's a map of a curse. It's a map of an arc of terror that Iran has created and imposed from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean.
He added that Iran has cut off trade, destroyed nations from within, and inflicted misery on millions of people. Meanwhile, in Lebanon on Friday, Israel says it attacked the headquarters of Hezbollah in the nation's capital. According to Israel, Hezbollah intentionally located the headquarters under residential buildings, using Lebanese people as human shields, but that Israel now took the step to strike it.
After almost a year of Israel warning the world and telling them that Hezbollah must be stopped, Israel is doing what every sovereign state in the world would do if they had a terror organization that seeks their destruction on their border.
Some reports say Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah was the target of the strike. However, there is no confirmation from either the US or Israel that that's the case. The US says it was not involved in the attack.
the secretary spoke with Minister Gallant when the operation was already underway, having no involvement, having no knowledge that this strike was actually going to occur.
When asked if the Hezbollah leader is still alive, she said that the U.S. is still gathering information at this point. Ariane Pastar, NTD News.
And in a breaking development in the Middle East, the United States and the Iraqi government have reached an agreement for the U.S. military to reduce its presence in Iraq by September 2025. Citing anonymous sources in the Iraqi government, the Associated Press reports that U.S. troops and coalition forces will leave certain bases in Iraq that they have occupied for over 20 years now, including Al-Assad Air Base. And U.S. and coalition troops will reportedly remain in Erbil in the Kurdish region in northern Iraq. NTD has not independently verified these reports. The American-led coalition in Iraq has been fighting the Islamic State terrorist group, also known as ISIS, since 2014. The presence of U.S. troops in Iraq also serves as a strategic position against Iranian influence in the region. We saw Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today speaking at the United Nations General Assembly. As conflicts remain unabated in Lebanon, he pledged to continue fighting Hezbollah terrorists at full force. What do the people make of the situation in the Middle East? NTD's Sam Wong was out at the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. to hear from them.
Benjamin Netanyahu is a pretty trustable leader, probably one of the best leaders in the world, and I'm sure he's going to do what's best for the Israel people.
Well, I think Israel needs to make greater efforts to try to bring an end to the war in Gaza.
Lebanon is already in a very bad financial situation, and now this is going to add more to the financial less stability in that area.
Lebanon used to be the freest country in the Middle East, and is no longer there because they opened the borders to everyone, and then they got kicked out.
There's always an opportunity for peace if we get down and sit at the same tables.
You can't be on the fence about killing people. That's it.
The Bible says friends of Israel will be blessed. I think the U.S. needs to be blessed at this time.
And do you think Israel has a right to defend itself?
Absolutely.
I do think Israel should be able to defend themselves, but I do think that too many innocent lives have been killed.
You always need to think about collateral damage. Peoples are peoples. Kids are kids.
Israel should definitely be allowed to defend themselves and look out Lebanon.
There needs to be more negotiation. We cannot, every time something happens, go to war.
You get bombarded every day, and you have to sit there and take it. I'm not going to let people just hit my kids, hurt my daughters, behead people, and just get away with it.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Here's our legal correspondent, Arlene Richards, with a breakdown of the lawsuits currently filed by Republican groups in the battleground state of North Carolina. Meanwhile, individual voters and liberal groups are challenging the state's new congressional maps.
Republican groups and individuals in North Carolina have filed a lot of lawsuits, primarily dealing with voter laws not being enforced. Meanwhile, some Democratic groups filed lawsuits last year challenging the congressional map. Those cases are still ongoing. North Carolina has 16 electoral college votes. In 2020, former President Trump won the state by a slim margin of about 1.4%. Going into the 2024 race, Trump had a bigger lead. But since the switch, Vice President Kamala Harris has built up some momentum in the state for Democrats. A recent 538 poll in North Carolina shows that the candidates are now tied, 47.5 for the former president and 47.4 for Harris. Now let's talk about the lawsuits. The most recent lawsuit filed on September 12th deals with a state photo ID law. The Republican National Committee, or RNC, says the law doesn't permit a digital form of the voter's ID when casting a ballot in person. They want the court to block University of North Carolina students from using their school-issued mobile ID cards. Election officials say the mobile ID meets the security and photo requirements set out in the law. The state court judge refused to ban the mobile ID cards. The RNC has now appealed that decision. And now let's look at another September case. Here, the RNC wants the county to stop accepting mail-in ballots that are not properly sealed in the envelope. Why? They take issue with the board instructing 100 counties to accept mail-in ballots that are not in sealed envelopes. The RNC says the envelope must be signed by the voter and 2 witnesses or 1 notary public before it can be submitted. Now let's go on to an August lawsuit by the committee. Now this is another ID case, but this one challenges the ID requirements for voter registration. Now the requirements here are for the applicant to provide a driver's license or social security number in order to register. But the RNC is claiming that the state has accepted 225,000 voter registration applications that didn't meet this requirement, which they say violates the Help America Vote Act. Now, the board has asked the court to move the case to federal court, claiming the act is a federal law. In a similar lawsuit, a Republican advocacy group claims the board failed to verify eligibility of at least 1.1 million facially invalid voter registrants. Now, let's move on to another August lawsuit. This one deals with a law that requires county court clerks to forward information to the board when they find out that individuals are not citizens. Now, the board is then supposed to make sure those people aren't on the voter rolls. But the committee says that the board isn't enforcing the rules. They want the court to order the board to remove non-citizens from voter rolls. Moving on to a case filed by a libertarian voter who's challenging North Carolina's law that bans photography in polling places. Now, the law doesn't allow voters to take or share photos that include an image of the completed ballot. They say the law violates the First Amendment. They're asking the court to block enforcement of the law, and Democrats are also filing lawsuits, but they are taking a different approach, and that is to challenge congressional maps. There's about 3 lawsuits filed since last November that allege violations under the Voters' Rights Act, including one case that claims the legislature violated the act by not engaging in race-based districting. Usually they're saying it is race-based. They want lawmakers to intentionally create a racially gerrymandered majority Senate district. Now that case is set for trial next year. I may have missed a few cases that could have been filed earlier, but I think this list is pretty extensive for the state of North Carolina, where Harris seems to have a chance at being the first Democrat to win the state in more than 40 years. Tiffany, back to you.
And control of the Senate will be decided on November 5th. 3 toss-up races could determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the upper chamber of Congress. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
Republicans are looking to regain control of the Senate come November 5th. Currently, Democrats control 48 seats in the Senate with the support of 3 independent senators for a total of 51 votes, while Republicans only control 49 seats. It is the strategy of the GOP to particularly target the vulnerable Democratic seats of Jon Tester and Sherrod Brown in the states of Montana and Ohio, respectively. In Montana, Jon Tester, who has been a senator since 2006, is trailing Republican candidate Tim Sheehy by 5.2 points. Sheehy is a former Navy SEAL and has received the endorsement of former President Donald Trump. Montana was a state carried by Trump in the past 2 elections. In the state of Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown is looking to secure his 4th term in office. Senator Brown is leading his Republican challenger Bernie Moreno by 3.6 points. It's important to note that Bernie Moreno was not the choice of the Ohio Republican Party, but won the primaries for the GOP with the endorsement of former President Donald Trump. Moreno, who was born in Colombia, has recently come under fire by Democrats for his pro-life stance on abortion. And in the battleground state of Michigan, Republicans are hoping to flip the seat of departing Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is stepping down after 24 years in office. Democrats tapped Congresswoman Elisa Slotkin to run to replace Stabenow, while Republicans picked former Congressman Mike Rogers, a former House Intelligence Committee chair. Rogers, who is also a former FBI special agent, is trailing Congresswoman Slotkin by 4.7 points. Republicans are hopeful, but they haven't won a Michigan Senate race since 1994. It is important to note that independent senators Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona and Joe Manchin of West Virginia are not running for re-election, widening the opportunities for Republicans to regain control of the Senate. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with a top Chinese diplomat in New York City today. It comes as the U.S. calls out China for supporting Russia's military. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more from the White House.
Secretary Blinken's meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi comes amid a clash of both ideology and policy over the past week at the UN General Assembly, specifically over controversy regarding China's military aggression in the South China Sea, the Chinese regime's extensive human rights abuses, and supplying Russia's war machine.
Roughly 70% of the machine tools that Russia's importing coming from China, Hong Kong, 90% of the microelectronics from China, Hong Kong. And this is materially helping the Russians produce the missiles, the rockets, the armored vehicles, the munitions that they need to perpetuate the war.
Today, the U.S. has new tariffs going into effect on China. It's a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, 60% on solar panel parts, and 25% on EV batteries, critical minerals, steel, aluminum, face masks. Now, these tariffs are used by the Biden administration in part to discourage China's unfair business practices. The Chinese regime heavily subsidizes its industries so it can flood the market with cheap products. Another issue is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which builds infrastructure projects in third world countries to gain economic and military dominance, but it leaves those countries saddled with billions in debt and failed projects. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has praised China's Belt and Road, but U.S. officials, on the other hand, have condemned it for its high interest rates. The U.S. and China have been keeping in contact in recent months, and a scheduled phone call is set to take place sometime in the near future between President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, according to the White House. Reporting from the White House, Jack Bradley, NTD News.
While U.S. leaders say they are clear-eyed about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, strong economic ties hamper progress in holding the regime accountable. Now, two lawmakers are setting a goal to begin divestment from China, starting on Wall Street. NTD's Melina Weisskopf reports.
Lawmakers are pushing legislation to encourage Americans to divest from the Chinese regime. A heavy lift considering how intertwined the U.S. and China economies are.
You know, when you think of the challenge we faced with the Soviet Union, our economies were not intertwined nearly to the degree that we are with China. And so when you look at our supply chain.
Senator Marco Rubio and Congressman John Molinar introduced a bill to revoke the lower capital gains tax rate on investments in communist China. Senator Rubio wrote of the bill, Wall Street continues to give money to our adversaries and reap rewards from the American tax system. Enough is enough. Investments in Chinese enterprises would instead be taxed at the highest income rate. Additionally, a bipartisan bill to crack down on the regime's violation of U.S. trade laws advanced in the House earlier this week. The string of legislative action follows weeks of D.C. policymakers zeroing in on the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to erode American values from the inside out.
The CCP and other foreign adversaries seek to keep us fighting, Republicans and Democrats fighting with each other, because in that state we are much weaker.
And the House this month passed a slate of bills to address the CCP's human rights abuses, reduce its influence on college campuses, address China's EV dominance, and sanction CCP officials, among other measures.
Xi's goal is to cover the world in communism. We are the ones who stand in his way.
Over in the Senate, Republicans unveiled their 2025 plans to counter China. They include bolstering support for Taiwan while addressing the Chinese regime's economic subversion and abuse of U.S. diplomats. This comes as Republicans hope to secure a majority in the Senate and take the gavel in the chamber's Foreign Relations Committee. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, here are some of today's top headlines. Hurricane Helene barreled across Florida's Big Bend region last night, leaving trails of damaged homes and toppled trees. The storm left at least 28 people dead in 4 states, forcing rescue teams to make urgent efforts to save residents from floodwaters. The storm has since weakened to a post-tropical cyclone. New York City Mayor Eric Adams pleaded not guilty today in federal court to charges of accepting bribes and illegal campaign contributions. His attorney announced plans to file a motion to dismiss the charges next week. Vice President Kamala Harris making her first trip to the U.S. southern border since becoming the Democratic nominee. In the border town of Douglas, Arizona, Harris's campaign aide says she's slated to address a litany of issues, including calling for more resources for Border Patrol agents and proposing new machines that can detect fentanyl. Former President Trump today meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in New York City. This marks the two leaders' first face-to-face meeting in 4 years. Trump said he is willing to work with both Russia and Ukraine to settle the war. And joining us now to discuss how the U.S. election could impact the war efforts is retired U.S. Navy captain and national security analyst Armen Kurdian. Armen, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again. To begin, during the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting today, Trump said he will resolve the war quickly with a peace deal. Now, Zelenskyy has previously been critical of Trump, saying the former president, quote, doesn't really know how to stop the war. How do you see a Trump administration handling the Russia-Ukraine war and NATO?
Hello, Tiffany. Well, on surface, I think Trump is going to look at it from a neutral third party. Obviously, the Biden administration has been very pro-Ukraine, supplying with weapons. We can argue as to whether that supply has been effective, whether it's been consistent enough, whether it's been the right types of weapons and the coordination among the Western nations. However, if you want to look back at recent history during the Trump administration, his prosecution of the war on ISIS was actually and basically over the 4-year period eliminated ISIS as a threat to global security. So Trump understands that, for lack of a better term, that a war between Russia and Ukraine is bad for business. So he's going to try and find a way to bring it to a conclusion. He's probably going to propose perhaps some kind of armistice or perhaps some kind of withdrawal. But all these nations are spending a lot of money, and we've seen 500,000, 700,000 people die so far and displaced. So that's not very good for the world. And Trump will at least try. And I believe if he does that, he might get some support from the rest of the world leaders on both sides of the equation to bring it to an end.
And as you mentioned, President Biden this week pledged another $8 billion in aid to Ukraine, which he says is to help win the war. How do you see a Harris administration handling the conflict? Would we see a continuation of Biden's approach?
I think you would see a continuation of the approach. The problem I've had with how the Biden administration has approached delivering weapons to Ukraine is it hasn't been 100% full throttle providing the weapons. It's like, okay, let's give them this, let's give them that. And the Western nations, NATO powers, giving them different weapons. Look at what Russia has done. In the early few months of the war, Russia seemed to be on its heels, not expecting this kind of perhaps military disaster, that it was thinking it was going to be very easy to walk in and take over Ukraine. But recently, they have absolutely ramped up to a full power wartime economy to the point where they're going to knock out about 4 million artillery shells per year, as well as new artillery pieces. In the United States, we're ramping up production to give to Ukraine, but only at the rate of about 1.2, 1.5 million per year. There's a lot of things that go into this. There's the raw materials, there's the labor, there's the capacity, there's supplying our own needs and own requirements. There's labor. There's a lot of issues that go into this, and you can't just simply turn on and say, I want to buy 10 million artillery rounds. It's just not that fast. So we are behind in that sense. If we had done that from the outset and really moved to a wartime economy and been really that serious about it, I believe the Western powers, the rest of NATO, would have done the same thing. And I don't believe the lines would be nearly as deep as they are right now. The war might have actually come to an end. When you're fighting a war, the best way to win a war is to win it before a single round is fired. But once people start shooting at each other, you need to bring it to an end as fast and as violently as possible. That's the only way to save lives, frankly.
And Armen, zooming out to the other major war when it comes to the conflicts in the Middle East, how do you see the result of the U.S. election impacting the region?
I don't see much of a difference. I believe a Trump administration and a Harris administration will prosecute the war fairly the same. It's possible that either one of them might be prosecuting it perhaps a little bit more directly. For example, Houthi rebels shooting at American ships in the Red Sea. As we all know, it's a lot cheaper to attack U.S. forces, a lot cheaper to attack Israel with rockets, missiles, and drones than it is to defend against them. Those types of weapons, those offensive weapons, are actually much easier to build, much easier to deliver, and much easier to shoot than it is the defensive weapons to actually knock them down. So there is a financial impact. And going back to what I said about Ukraine, building and putting out these types of defensive weapons, the Arrow missile, the Timir missile, the Standard missile, the rolling airframe missile, is a much harder proposition for the United States and its allies to do in terms of taking these weapons out when they're fired. You've got to take them out on the ground with bombs, if at all possible. That is why Israel really decided, okay, we're going to ramp it way up the escalation scale, and we're going to see, if we see launchers anywhere within 20 miles or 30 miles of our border, we're going to take them out, and they're not taking it anymore. So that's a way of basically preserving your own defensive capability. The U.S. needs to do the same thing with the Houthi rebels, along with our NATO allies, Britain, France, and those other countries, to say in one voice, this has got to stop.
And critics are accusing the Biden administration of pushing Israel to de-escalate tensions with Lebanon in hopes of preventing a broader war in the region so close to the election. What is your assessment of this? Could the proximity of the U.S. election be impacting the administration's response?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I don't believe it does. If you want to look back at the last year as to how the administration has handled the war between Israel and Gaza, and now, if you want to call it this war between Israel and Hezbollah, it's been, again, a little bit inconsistent. A lot of public chastising of Israel, a lot of public praise of Israel. Biden is trying to basically cater to the far left progressive wing of his own party. Republicans are very united in their support of Israel in this war, much more so than they are in the war against Ukraine. I think it's a very interesting dynamic that we actually see there. But I don't see that strategy is going to change before November. If possibly that there is some kind of peace deal or ceasefire between now and November 5th, it could be seen to help a potential Harris victory in November. I don't see that happening. I think if there is a ceasefire, Israel is going to have it on their own terms, and it's going to be through strength, not through perhaps the mush-mouth type of diplomacy that we sometimes have seen. It would be nice to bring it to a conclusion. We'll have to see what actually happens.
And speaking of November, the Justice Department today charged 3 Iranians with hacking Trump's campaign. Now, this does come amid reports of an alleged Iranian assassination plot against the former president. It appears Iran is attempting to interfere with the U.S. election. What is your assessment here?
Absolutely, they are. They've been trying to interfere in internal affairs for a very long time, whether it's directly within the election or cyber attacks, hacking, theft of, basically, email attacks, any types of these types of cyber attacks that we've seen. Iran in the Middle East has a strategic initiative right now, I think, in terms of how they are how they're handling. I think Israel is trying to take that back a little bit through a lot of the funding that Israel has had through a lot of their proxies. This administration really fumbled the ball by relaxing some of these constraints against Iran and allowing Iran to refund and rearm a lot of these proxies. Iran is the world's greatest destabilizer. They're less of a rational actor than, say, China or Russia. Those guys are a little bit more predictable. Iran is not. There's an element of fanaticism to them that the other two major adversaries of the United States do not actually have. So Iran needs to be contained. It is in the world's interest to see Iran contained. Ultimately, it would be great for Iran to return to the community of nations. Frankly, it's a great country. The last time I was there, I was almost 5 years old. The people there are very smart, very intelligent. Frankly, it's my favorite food in the world. But this country, this miserable, stinking religious theocracy, has brought pain and misery to the planet for almost half of a century. Until that regime is ended, you're going to continue to see this type of destabilizing influence that Iran has, and this continued effort to try to destabilize Israel and keep the United States and the West off balance in the Middle East.
Armin Kurdian, retired U.S. Navy captain and national security analyst, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie.
The U.S. Coast Guard wraps up its hearing into OceanGate's Titan submersible. Investigators have been examining what led to the loss of the vessel, which tragically imploded last year. NTD's David Lamb reports.
2 weeks of testimony around what happened when the Titan submersible imploded have just concluded. 5 people died in the June 2023 incident, including the CEO of OceanGate, the company that built and operated it.
The testimony gathered over the past 2 weeks has been critical, but there is still more work to be done as we move into the next phase of our investigation. Our commitment to transparency remains a priority, and our final report will be essential in shaping future safety standards.
Witnesses testified that the company put profits over safety and ignored warning signs before the disaster. They said the sub did not get proper certification and that the tragedy could have been prevented.
The conversation basically ended when he, after explaining that the Coast Guard had tried to, shut him down in California, and that he wouldn't operate there anymore, but that if the Coast Guard became a problem, that he would buy himself a congressman and make it go away.
The late CEO said the sub was developed with the help of NASA, but during the hearing, an engineer said NASA had little involvement.
We did not. The COVID pandemic occurred and we weren't able to accomplish any of the fabrication. We provided remote consultation throughout the build of their 1/3 scale article, but we did not do any manufacturing or testing of their cylinders.
Another witness said the CEO, Stockton Rush, and crew were passionate explorers who had assessed risks involved in the dive, that their goal was to allow more people to experience the deep sea. The sub was heading to view the wreckage of the sunken Titanic. The vessel's lightweight carbon fiber hull and its structure were discussed in length during the hearings. The Coast Guard's investigation is tasked with determining why it imploded. People on board the Titan paid $250,000 each to join the voyage. The remains of the Titan were found near the Titanic. David Lamb, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty to discuss today, but let's start in baseball, where both the Yankees and Dodgers clinched their divisions last night. Where are we at with the remaining playoff spots?
Well, there's still 2 out of the 3 wild cards in both leagues that have yet to be decided. Now, in the American League, Kansas City and Detroit both lead Minnesota by 3 games with 3 games left. So a loss by the Twins or a win by the Tigers or Royals clinches a spot. Now, meanwhile, in the National League, it's a similar story. 3 teams fighting for 2 spots, with only a game separating them. But there's a twist here. Hurricane Helene has really been playing havok with the schedule because Atlanta is one of those 3 contending teams. They haven't been able to play the last 2 nights because of the weather. And the team they were scheduled to play, the Mets, are also one of those 3 teams in contention. So they're to make up these games, they're going to have a doubleheader on Monday, which is the day before the playoffs start. Quite frankly, that's a terrible time for this because your pitching staff is then going to be worn out just in time for the playoffs to start, but they don't really have too many options. And even tonight, Atlanta is scheduled to host Kansas City for the first of a 3-game set in Atlanta. I mean, is the weather even going to allow them to play? I mean, we'll have to see. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty kind of around the playoffs right now.
Now, regarding the Yankees, outfielder Aaron Judge, who still leads the majors in home runs, has now homered in 5 straight games to put him at 58. Is there any talk of him breaking his own record?
I mean, if he homers tonight, there certainly will be. You know, we talked about this maybe like a month ago when he hit number 51. That was back on August 25th. Then he went nearly 3 weeks without hitting another one, but now he's back on fire again. But there's only 3 games left, so even if he continues his torrid pace, that's 1 per game, he'd still end up just 1 shy of that record 62 that he hit 2 years ago. But there's also the question of whether he continued to play or not now that the Yankees have clinched the division title. I think the Yankees will at least play their starters until they clinch home field advantage in the playoffs. And that could come down to the final game on Sunday because there's only a 1-game lead over Cleveland right now. Even if he does play all 3 games, you have to hit 5 home runs, and you have to do that against Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is going to start rookie Paul Skeens on Saturday, who has been absolutely devastating this year. One of the best pitchers in the league. He's the overwhelming favorite to win Cy Young. I think he's allowed 10 home runs in 22 starts. So Judge certainly has his work cut out for him.
Looking at college football this weekend, there's a major game in the SEC as Alabama hosts Georgia. Now, does the new expanded playoff format affect this game?
You know, I think it affects whoever loses this game, because with the expanded format, you still have a pretty good shot at making the postseason, even with lone loss, especially if you're in the SEC, which is loaded this year, or the Big Ten. I mean, these probably will be loaded for quite a while. Now, just to back up, in previous years, we only had 4 playoff spots. This year, we have 12. We got 5 automatic conference winners, plus 7 at-large bids that are going to be selected by committee. And these 2 programs, Georgia and Alabama, they've combined to win 3 of the last 4 national titles. Both teams are ranked in the top 5. Whoever wins this is certainly in the driver's seat to win the SEC, but you still have to deal with number 1 ranked Texas and 6th ranked Ole Miss. They're loaded as well. So in a very early prediction, I'm going to say the SEC probably gets at least 3 of these 7 at-large bids come playoff time. Now, as for tomorrow, I'm going to take Alabama in a tight one over Georgia, only because the game is at Alabama. So there you have it.
Well, Davis, always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.